So just getting right into the crux of the issue, how do you value future picks?
And you're going to laugh at me because I personally hate player comps. And I think it's really important.
Click back and you watch again, and it's a really arduous process. It's a monotonous process.
I think that's the whole answer to a lot of our ranking symposium is, the adjusting process is about how players' values do change.
What's going on, fam? Welcome to another edition of the Dynasty Underdog Ranking Symposium. This edition, we're going to be covering how we value future picks and adding them into our rankings. Really just like how we go about doing that, which I think is a really interesting conversation because it's definitely not cut and dry. So just getting right into the crux of the issue, how do you value future picks? That is the biggest question here. How do you value them, right? Because ideally you'd be able to just give them assign them a value. They're 1,000 points, and that's how much the player next to them is, 999 or whatever it is, right? Like you'd have it just in a very sequential order, but that's not really the way it works because each year the picks hold different values based on the incoming rookie class, right? And if we're looking ahead to this coming year in 2025, the QB class isn't the best. It's really not a sought after group in the upcoming class, and therefore the picks are devalued a little bit, especially in Superflex. That's the primary format that we play. So if I just add our rankings to the screen here, we see our 2025 first round pick falls in between a Tua and a Trevor Lawrence, right? And so I'm taking a long way to grandma's house here talking about kind of how I value picks, but I think one of the most essential things to do, and really the only way, in my opinion, that I can get a good handle on how much the pick is worth is go and look at, the 2025 incoming rookie class and say to yourself, the number one pick in this class is going to be Luther Burden, wide receiver Luther Burden, or Evan Stewart. We're not talking about a Quinn Ewers up at the top here. Okay. So, even looking at our ranking, I'm a little concerned that we might be a little too high having that 25 first over Tua. Like, is the 101 really going to be worth more than Tua or Garrett Wilson or Trey McBride? I think I might have the 25 first just below Drake May or just below Brock Bowers. I think I made that adjustment in my personal rankings. So I think this is just kind of where it falls for us. And you can see it went down 4 spots. That's the latest shift for the 2025 first. So based on my drop, that's what happened. But I do think just looking at it, that's kind of how I'm valuing these picks, right? I need to, at least for the 101, I need to get that baseline of where do I value this 101 amongst the group of players. And then from there, it's, a descending talent value, right? For the most part. So you can kind of slowly insert them into your rankings. And that's obviously inserting them into your rankings is the best way to kind of understand your own values. But that's for me just at a very baseline level, like how much is a 2025 first worth before I've done any work, from a film perspective or even from a data perspective on the 25 group. How am I going to assign a value to that? For me, I need to at least go look at that first or second or third guy and get some kind of roundabout value in my head. Like, hey, okay, this is where he is. That's where 101 falls. And then I go from there. How do you kind of go about it, Jake?
Yeah, I would say I go about it almost the same exact way. I do think that there's a gauge of probably the top 4 or 5 prospects that I try to kind of zone in on, know that one of those 5 are going to be competing for that 101. And that's really where I'm trying to fall into this range. I'm not trying to necessarily pick the 101. I'm not trying to necessarily pick the 102, but I'm trying to kind of give myself a variety of ranges, a variety of values with this kind of placeholder that we have here where, it's an early first. It's not necessarily holding at the 103. It's not necessarily holding at the 101. I'm trying to kind of build an average to understand where I want this to live. And I don't necessarily disagree with you with the idea that maybe this is slightly overvalued right now. I think this is also kind of how the conversation works is throughout the year, this pick gains value, right? The more we learn about those players, the more we learn of them in their 3rd years, their 4th years, moving into potential draft conversation. We're talking about gaining value for those players. And right now is probably where they're at their cheapest. And right now, having them sitting where we do maybe isn't the best for this exercise, but I think for the conversation as a whole, really kind of lets you know as the viewer kind of how we're trying to shift that gauge or that range of values throughout the different parts of this conversation.
Absolutely. And we've talked about, obviously, both of us, I think, need to kind of assign a player to the pick when we're adding it into the rankings. Like you have to do that. So then you can say, does, X player or players fall within this range, and where can I reasonably place this pick? But if that's how we're doing it, and like I said, we haven't done the work, I guess. How do we get an understanding of who these players are? Or is it just over time, we start with this baseline like we're talking about, and then over time as we work through the profiles, that's how we can kind of better adjust. Is that the answer to it?
I personally think it is. I think that's the whole answer to a lot of our ranking symposium is, the adjusting process is about how players' values do change. We're talking about what we're gauging something at right now at this specific time. I think we can even think about what we were doing in 2024 or for the 2024 early first placeholder. I
Hmm.
think that pick sat somewhere in probably the 17, 18 range for the first couple of placeholders that we had, right? And right now, Caleb Williams is sitting at, I think, 11 overall or something along those lines. So,
Hmm.
there is a process in place where we have to continue to kind of move that needle to the place in which we think it's going to fit our values the best. And right now, I think probably moving this piece slightly down and then rearranging as we learn a little bit more about the player pool makes more sense for us to feel a little bit safer. At this given time, I'm not willing to, mess with potentially trading someone like Tua for a potential wide receiver one out of this class for the 101 next year. Currently, it just doesn't really make sense for me. And if I'm holding the 101 in most cases, it's usually because I'm tanking. So that would make a lot of sense for me to try and rebuild in that type of situation to have potentially a star quarterback who's going to probably land a 55 to 60 million dollar contract for the next 4 to 5 years, right? So that logic makes sense from the buying perspective of Tua, but it doesn't make sense from the selling perspective of the 101. So I think that's just kind of the logic that you need to put in place a little bit better when we're talking through these values.
Yeah, and I think right now it's just so uncertain. And you look at the 25 QB class: Quinn Ewers, Carson Beck,
Oof.
Connor Wegman, Jalen Milrow, Drew Aller, Shador Sanders. Like maybe one of these guys or two of these guys, Jackson Dart. Maybe somebody has just like an absolutely monster year and jumps up to the 101. But then I feel like we're almost in like Kenny Pickett territory again, where
Yep.
we're pushing the guy too high. So just kind of, I'm just highlighting, I think, why we need to move down this 25 pick a little bit, and then we can slowly adjust it up as needed. And I think that's the best process that you can have in terms of valuing picks and adding them and adjusting them within your rankings, right? You need to just have that careful process of, all right, first, let me get a good idea of like what the player values are right now in terms of the class I'm talking about. Place that appropriately amongst, the current NFL group, and then go from there. Just quickly talk, because we just recently went from the 24 picks to adding the rookie
Hmm.
players, and you could see them in here: Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors up at the top there. You can see those kind of guys in our rankings now. And I think it is maybe worth having the conversation a little bit of, without those landing spots, without having the landing spot from Malik Neighbors, from Marvin Harrison, like how are we appropriately valuing them? And I mean, I know how I'm doing it, and I know the best process for me, but I'll come in after you. What's your best process for kind of giving yourself a value for a Malik Neighbors right now before he has a landing spot, knowing it could be the Giants, it could be any team, right? We don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, it's specifically, especially for like the high caliber elite athletes, it's really honing in on those elite traits. So I really hone in on first off tape. I think I get swayed by players tape more often than not, and it's probably why Malik Neighbors right now sits ahead of Marvin Harrison Jr. in our own rankings. Is probably because of me, and I'm sorry for that. But
Yeah.
we're in this situation to try and provide ourselves value for how we're going to hone in on these players and where they sit within our rankings. I think the biggest thing for me is really just kind of like garnering as much information as I can externally. So, Uriah talks about this a lot on player prospects, especially on the live show, and looking at average ADP going into what, the writers, journalists think that players are going to land. I do necessarily think about how journalists are thinking how NFL teams are going to perform. That's really
Hmm.
important to me. I also do believe in coach speak as well. So coach speak that kind of builds up into this process does have value for me. When NFL coaches start to interview and talk about players,
Hmm.
they're usually on the radar, especially for the top 10 guys in the NFL draft. And that will kind of gauge me in a certain direction. And sometimes that's up and down. So in a negative direction is going to be someone like a Drake May. I think there's been a lot of negative buzz about a player like him where he didn't necessarily pass my own personal sniff test. And I have him a bit lower than I think the community does. That's totally fine. I'm happy with adjusting if need be, but I would be more than happy giving up on someone like him for a Malik Neighbors, a Marvin Harrison Jr., a Jaden Daniels, potentially even a Brock Bowers. Like, I'm happy with those prospects being above someone like that based on the multiple aspects that I talked about right here. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of you basically said what I wanted you to say at the beginning, which is for me, before they have a landing spot, the work that we're doing on the live shows every week, the film rooms I put out, like those are so important for gaining an understanding of how I value each player because without it, I find that I'm lost. Like if I haven't done a film review on a guy like AD Mitchell, I can't even rank him personally. So for me, like you, I do lean on film heavily. I go and I look at the numbers and I see these guys and I see low yards per route run for AD Mitchell versus Xavier Worthy. And then I got to go look at the tape and understand why that is, what's going on here, what that's about. And then once I've seen them on tape, it's not just about, oh, like it's confirming what I see here. It's understanding how this guy moves. Does he move like a Puka? Does he move like a Garrett Wilson? What kind of archetype of player am I even talking about here? That's why it's hard for me to understand guys who only look at the spreadsheets because like how can you even understand what a Puka was last year without going and watching what he was doing? So you got to have that mix, but for me it's so key to it's so fundamental to my process that I get that really defined a look at the player from a film perspective so I can gauge who he is, what he does, and where he should be placed amongst the group of players. So I wanted to get that out there because I do think that, our scouting process, the way we go about it is very thorough and and very defined at this point. Like I have, key attributes I've worked out over years that I grade each player on. I've become very stringent about my process, and I think that we have a good idea of what we're trying to look for, and that is so key in our process. So I want to make sure that we get that across, because I don't think that you can have a full view of a player's profile without having a good understanding of what he's actually doing on the football field on the film.
I want to say one additional thing because you just made me think this, and I think
Yeah, yeah.
that I am totally on board with you. And you're going to laugh at me because I personally hate player comps. And I think it's really important when you're going through this process, seriously, to not compare a specific player to another player and think that that's going to be, the career arc of that player. I think it's
Mhm.
really important when you're watching tape to understand that each player is its own nuance, right? It's its own entity. It's going to live its own life form. Just because someone has the same stride as another player doesn't mean that they run the same, doesn't mean that they cut the same, doesn't mean that they have the same brain. And when you're going through this process, you need to kind of delineate and change the way that your mind wants to hone in on one given thing Instead, kind of branch them all out as separate traits. Don't allow them to build into one another. Instead, similar to what Billy's internalized reviewing process is like, you have these individual traits that live separately, and when 3 or 4 of them turn into elite, that player is going to be elite. When one of them is elite and it matches Tyreek Hill and the other 5 suck, the player is probably not going to land at the same level as a Tyreek Hill. And it's really important to understand that, especially when you're trying to gauge them in this ranking exercise that you're going through, because
Yeah.
so much of what we do as humans is we see things that we want to replicate. We see that someone is doing something similar to someone else, but the reality is that they're not the same because of so many other nuances that it's important for you to hone in on.
That's why I've created my process the way I have, because I think that it removes a lot of the bias, right? You're just grading the specific attribute. You're just going through the tape and you go, you know, I'm going to watch him for his release. I'm going to watch him for his separation. I'm going to watch him for his burst. I'm going to watch him for his sideline and boundary awareness. I'm going to watch him for this, and you go through the tape and you watch and you go click back and you watch again, and it's a really arduous process. It's a monotonous process. It's not and honestly, you kind of you definitely have to love it at some extent. Like I really enjoy it, and I enjoy finding different traits in a player and all those kind of things, and finding, like Jake saying, those elite traits in players, right? It's like, it's super, you're like, oh, wow, got one. So you definitely got to love it to some extent, but it is really about breaking it down, I think, to those fundamental levels and building a profile ground up and really understanding what the player is, who the player is, what they're about. And that is going from, the pick level to the player level. And I think it's important to talk about that when, we're working from our process of trying to find a reasonable place for, the 2024 pick, slowly moving that up, then, finding a good landing spot for that, which I think for us ended up being around like pick 13-ish, maybe 12-ish or whatever for us overall in our rankings. And then from there, you add the players in, and you can kind of build these profiles we're talking about and layer them out throughout the rest of your rankings. So that's kind of the process. And then you do it all over again with the 2025 picks, right? And I think we, explained at the beginning how this class coming up is kind of unique compared to the last one. And you're going to have to do that every single year. And if you follow that same process, you're probably going to have pretty good results at the end of the day. So I think we got to the answer here, right? We got down to it. We got to the bottom of it. How do you value rookie picks? That's what we got down to the bottom of today. I think this was a really fun conversation. Yeah, we might have another Ranking Symposium episode talking about some KTZ values. Who knows? I think as we, go along and kind of go through our ranking process throughout the year, we might find new topics that kind of fall under the Ranking Symposium umbrella. So stay tuned for that. Otherwise, check out our live show every week. Me and Jake did the DU debates. We're going to have that series coming out with, more editions. Check out my film room, join our YouTube channel, subscribe, tons of stuff coming out there. Follow the podcast, all that good stuff. And most importantly, join our Discord, because we have a ton of fun in there. You can find it like on our YouTube, everywhere. So yeah, with that said, I'll stop talking. Thank you guys so much for joining us for this edition of the Dynasty Underdog Ranking Symposium. Thank you, Jake, for being here. Everybody, have a good one. Peace out.